To give some insights into the pandemic in general and the role of Indian science and technology in the fight against COVID-19, we are privileged to have with us Dr. Shekhar Mande. Dr. Mande is Secretary, Department of Scientific and Industrial Research, and Director General of CSIR. Before taking up his current position, he was Director, National Centre for Cell Science, Pune. He obtained his BSc and MSc from Nagpur University before earning a PhD from the Indian Institute of Science. Dr. Mande has several awards and fellowships to his credit. He is a fellow of the Indian National Science Academy, the National Academy of Sciences, and the Indian Academy of Sciences. He has also been a Wellcome Trust Fellow. Dr. Mande is an awardee of the Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar Prize for Biological Sciences. In conversation with Dr. Mande is Mr. Dattaraj Salgaocar. Mr. Salgaocar is the chairman of the VM Salgaocar Corporation Private Limited. He has successfully led the Goa-based group to diversify into real estate, hospitality, and private equity. He is passionate about education in the arts, and his foundation runs schools and colleges in Goa in English and in local Konkani, including higher education from hospitality to a law college. He's a production engineer from VJTI Bombay University and an MBA from Wharton Business School. He founded the Sunapran Goa Center for the Arts in 2007, which focuses on arts-based community and pedagogical programming, which has transformed the Goan cultural landscape. Mr. Salgaocar is a founder member of ICG and presently is our vice president. He now chairs the ICG Programs Committee and has been the driving force behind our ICG Zoom webinars. Before we start the session today, I'm pleased to announce that our next webinar program will be held in the second half of March next month and will feature India's Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar. I now hand over the session to Mr. Salgaocar, and I hope you find it interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Yatin, for your introductory remarks, and welcome, Dr. Mande. In fact, it's a great honor and pleasure to have you with us. Thank you for making time for us from an incredibly busy schedule to be with us today. So let me dive straight in, Dr. Mande, into the questions to you. It's almost been 12 months since COVID-19 struck India, and millions of lives have been altered or affected, either directly or indirectly. Can you tell us, Dr. Mande, about where we are with the virus today?
Thank you, Mr. Salgaocar. First of all, it's a great privilege for me to be able to be with you this evening. Thank you all for inviting me here for the same. Now, today's situation, as we see in India, the numbers have been steadily declining. We had our peak in the second half of September, and since then, numbers have steadily declined. In fact, in August and September, it was a bit worrying situation when every day we were reporting something like 90,000 to about 100,000 cases per day. But that number, thankfully, now has dropped down to about 10,000 to 12,000 per day. There are multiple reasons behind this. Many of the reasons are speculative, so we will not go into them. But in pockets, the numbers have been rising of late, and that's a bit of a concern for all of us. For example, in Kerala and some parts of Maharashtra, the numbers have increased in the past few days, and that might be a reflection of the fact that people have become complacent and people probably believe that the worst is behind us. And through the forum that what we are here today, I would sincerely appeal to all our listeners that the worst is not over, and unless we follow due diligence, unless we follow all the precautions, we'll not be able to get over the pandemic so easily.
So pandemics have been with us throughout human history. In the recent past, we had the Spanish flu with over they say 20 million deaths and has claimed a lot of lives. Of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has already taken 2.5 million lives. I mean, out of which I'm told around 1.5 lakh is from India. So how is this particular pandemic different from all the other influenza, flus, and other pandemics?
So, see, the pandemic during the evolution of Earth have been there since the inception of life. Even much before human beings came into being, there has always been a predator-prey relationship that has existed between different life forms. Even the tiny bacteria that we see are susceptible to what are called as bacteriophages. And that's the predator-prey relationship that exists between many different kinds of organisms. The human race itself, since its evolution, has seen many diseases, but the pandemics and the epidemics became more prevalent ever since we started forming colonies. About 11 to 15,000 years ago, when human beings started cultivation of agriculture and so on and so forth, and started forming colonies, the diseases which transmit from one individual to another, they became more prevalent, right? Now, we have seen multiple pandemics through the history. There have been plague, there's been a black plague, tuberculosis, white plague, what we call as a plague, and so on and so forth. You rightly mentioned 1918, 1919 was a Spanish flu, which killed a huge amount of people. About 1/3 of the world's population was infected with Spanish flu then in 1918, 1919. Now, in some sense, coronavirus is different. Some sense it's similar. We have seen the severe acute respiratory syndrome in the Southeast Asian countries about 10, 15 years ago. 15 years ago, there was an epidemic of SARS-CoV. It's called coronavirus because it looks like a corona. It has a lipid membrane. And on the surface, you have these spikes coming out, looks like a corona. And therefore, it's called coronavirus. A cousin of this is also what is called as the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome virus, or MERS-CoV. That's much more deadly than SARS-CoV-2. Very, very deadly. So, but thankfully, it has not become a pandemic. It has been restricted to a particular region. Now, the pandemic is different in the sense that you asked me, because we have been priding ourselves for last about 30, 40, 50 years that the healthcare system has advanced so much that we'll be able to deal with any kind of situation or emergency that arises. But the current pandemic is a grim reminder that's not the case. When we have been expecting the next pandemic just around the corner, we have been found to be wanting in all respects. In fact, the most advanced nations, the nations which have prided themselves with having the most advanced healthcare systems, have been worst affected. And that's a very, very grim reminder that such kind of pandemics will continue hitting us, will continue hitting humanity, and we better be prepared for them right now, even for the future pandemic.
So, is there any consensus now that how this COVID-19 particularly spreads, and how can it be prevented? And because we hear a lot of mutant strains of this particular COVID-19, and especially the South African strain and the British Kent strain, which is supposed to be quite deadly, and how to combat it. The vaccines have to be, they say, given booster shots and all. So is there some consensus that how this thing mutates and spreads?
Yes, so mutations are known, of course. Mutations have long been known. Even before the pandemic came, we knew that if there is a next viral pandemic, there will be mutations. Mutation is a natural process. When the virus enters the body, it makes millions of copies of itself in our body. And every time it makes a copy of itself, there is a chance of a mutation that would accumulate. Now, what happens is that body also launches an immune response against the virus. And therefore, the mutations which are best adapted to survive against that immune response are the ones that proliferate, right? This is a very natural process that there would be mutations, random mutations in any organism for that matter, not only a virus. And those mutations survive, which are best adapted to survive in that particular environmental or contextual, whatever it is. So that's a natural process. But as far as how the virus spreads, we have actually understood a great deal in last 1 year. And I'll make a bit provocative statements. Please bear me with that. Some of it is personal opinion, some of it is considered opinion of the scientific community. Now, the personal opinion and a large section of the scientists do believe that a virus spreads essentially through aerosols, or the droplets, what we call droplet nuclei. So when we are speaking, we actually are emitting lots of aerosols through our mouth. When we speak loudly, we even do more. When we sing, there's even more. And these droplet nuclei, they contain the entrapped virus, which is actually exists in the upper respiratory tract. When an infected individual has virus in the upper respiratory tract, in the nose, in the mouth, and so on and so forth, and the virus gets entrapped in these nuclei, and when we speak, these nuclei are emitted, exhaled from us, and they remain hanging in air for quite a while. If at that time a healthy individual inhales those nuclei, now is susceptible to have contacted a virus, right? I mean, that's the most consensus view that has emerged. Now, WHO has steadfastly maintained that the virus is not airborne. So what I described to you just now is a process called airborne infection. WHO has for some reason maintained it's not airborne, but many of us believe that WHO's position is rather rigid and not rational. WHO believes that it spreads through contaminated surfaces. A large body of scientific opinion today says that more than contaminated surfaces, it spreads through the air, right, through droplet nuclei. Now let us face this particular aspect. Now, therefore, it's natural that in open, well-ventilated area, the droplet nuclei or the aerosols, they would dissipate very easily. They will not remain hanging in one place and they would actually dissipate very quickly. On the other hand, in less ventilated places, in closed areas, they would remain hanging for a long time. And in fact, we have now proven it. Our two labs, CCMB Hyderabad and IMTech Chandigarh, have scientifically proven that if an infected individual exists in a room, let us say 10 by 10 feet, there would be plenty of droplet nuclei that remain hanging or suspended in the air for a while, right? And therefore, a healthy individual entering that room would now be susceptible for infection. And therefore, we have been always telling people that please avoid less ventilated areas, please prefer open areas. Similarly, if there are more number of individuals who are infected, there will be more droplet nuclei floating around in the air. And therefore, we must avoid gathering of people, whatever the functions may be, whether it be religious, whether it be social, whatever. As long as we are able to avoid gatherings, we reduce the probability of having these droplet nuclei in air, and therefore we reduce the probability of infecting others. So now coming to the question of mutations and vaccines and all, it's a very relevant question. As I said, mutation is a natural process. Viruses would accumulate mutations, and those mutations which survive the best, they would proliferate. As you would have heard in the early part of the pandemic last year, there was a talk of a mutation called D614G that actually became prevalent around the world. And that spread quite widely across the world. And in fact, that took over the earlier virus that was spreading across. But over a period of time, the virus has started accumulating many other mutations. In the UK strain, what is typically called as N501 is also called as V1 or B117. This has actually accumulated something like a large number of mutations, which is a bit concerning. It appears that at one point of time, by a chance event, the virus accumulated very large number of mutations, about 17 of them on the protein which interacts with human cells, the spike protein that interacts with the human cells. And therefore, it was a bit worrying that what this mutant would do. And indeed, it was shown later that this mutant has the ability to spread quicker. In a sense, if we assume that one person had ability to transmit virus to 10 other people, 10 healthy people, this particular mutant, a person would have ability to transmit to about 15 or 16 people. So this mutant actually spreads faster, quicker to other people. But whether the ability to spread more and whether it's more lethal, they're two different issues. And yet the final word is not out whether the mutant is more lethal or not. Whether one person being infected by this new mutant virus, whether that person is more likely to die of this particular mutation is not very clear. It's clear there's more transmissible, but it's not clear whether it's more lethal. Now, about the vaccines against the mutants, it's a very relevant point, and at that point, many people actually have curiosity whether vaccination would protect you against the mutant also or not. What happens is that...
I think, Dr. Mande, what we can do is we can go to the vaccines itself, I think, before we go to the vaccine. So my question would be that, from what I understand, there are 4 types of vaccines. You have the whole virus, the protein subunit, the viral vector, and the nucleic acid. So could you just explain these types of vaccines? Because a lot of our people may not know, and coming from you, it would be great that there are 4 vaccines, and what does each one do, and how about their efficacy of each, and then we'll talk about the vaccines against the mutants, if you don't mind.
Perfect. I think what you're saying is absolutely makes sense that we first talk about the vaccines. See, what happens is that a vaccine is that entity which prepares our body's immunity to fight when it actually sees the correct infection. right? So let us take the case of SARS-CoV-2. A vaccine actually would prepare our body before SARS-CoV-2 is encountered by our body. All right. So the body does that by eliciting immune response. Right. The body has a natural immune defense against any invading pathogen. Now, if we prepare our body for SARS-CoV-2, there will be multiple ways that we can prepare our body for SARS-CoV-2. Basically, we have to fool the body's immune system that a virus is going to look like it when your body actually encounters the real virus. So that immune system is now prepared for looking at the actual virus. You can take the whole virus as it is, and you can inactivate it. Right? It's a heat inactivated virus. For example, what Bharat Biotech has done, or what we call as Covaxin, is an inactivated virus. So they have cultured a virus in certain cells, and after culturing virus in those cells, they inactivated using heat, so that when you inject this inactivated virus in our body, the virus will not multiply in our body, but yet the body's immune system would be trained against this particular inactivated virus. And therefore, when actual SARS-CoV-2 comes, CO2 enters our body, the body would immediately launch an attack and get rid of the virus. So that's one way of actually priming our body. The second way would be the virus itself has many different components. As I said, it has a lipid surface and has spikes coming out of it. Now, spike is a protein, and that spike is the one which is responsible for attaching the virus to the human cells. Then the spike attaches to human cells, and then human cells actually internalize the virus, and then they starts replicating within a cell in our body. Now, if you actually have only the spike protein and inject that into a human being, the human immune system once again will react to this spike protein, and there will be antibodies generated against this spike protein. Therefore, when the actual virus enters the body, these antibodies would already neutralize the spike so that the spike protein and the virus cannot enter our human cells. So there is another approach, and typically AstraZeneca vaccine that you have heard of, that is being developed by, also conducted by Serum Institute of India in this thing, that is the spike protein that is made artificially in certain cells, but only the spike protein. There's only a small component of the virus that is being taken, and it is attached to what is called as an adenovirus vector. Adenovirus is some kind of a common cold virus, and that elicits a very strong immune response in the body. Therefore, you take a spike protein, attach it to the adenovirus, and inject it into our body. So body now is primed to actually look at the spike protein, and thereby when entire virus enters the body, it is primed to actually have immune response against the whole virus. The nucleic acid viruses, nucleic acid vaccines are of two different kinds. One is the DNA, of course, that Dattaraj Salgaocar is developing in Ahmedabad, the DNA-based vaccine, and that would be delivered through a skin patch, and that's a different kind of a virus. But a very exciting development that has taken place in last about 10-15 years, and it was rather unsung. The people who developed this particular approach called messenger RNA, or in short, mRNA-based vaccines, they were rather unsung heroes until COVID period came up. And the mRNA vaccines have been developed by two principal companies. They haven't received approval in India yet, but we are trying our best at this moment. How do we bring these companies to India? One of them is, of course, Pfizer, that you would have heard of, and other is called Moderna. So both these companies have developed an mRNA-based vaccine. Now, mRNA essentially, as I told you about the spike protein that attaches to human cell surface, the protein in any cell is made from the genetic material. Typically in human body is DNA, but between DNA and protein, there is an intermediate step called RNA, right? So the DNA is always encoded into an RNA, and the RNA then encodes itself into a protein. So that RNA is called as the messenger RNA. And the virus, therefore, also the spike protein, has a messenger RNA that has information to make the spike protein. What these two companies do, Pfizer and Moderna, is they take the mRNA of the spike protein, exactly the mRNA that corresponds to the spike protein, encapsulated in lipid nanoparticles. Lipid nanoparticles are the particles which have the ability to fuse with our own cells, right? And these encapsulated particles are injected into our body. Now, what happens is our body is now fooled because it sees that mRNA, and our body cells then start actually making copies of the spike protein from the mRNA that has been injected. So body cell machinery is essentially some sort of a fooling of the system. So it makes the spike protein. But as soon as the spike protein comes into blood circulation, this particular spike protein, the immune system reacts to it, our body's immune system. And therefore, we generate large number of antibodies against this spike protein that has been injected in our body. And these antibodies are now very useful when the actual virus is encountered by the body. So when the real virus comes in our body, these antibodies would immediately launch an attack on the virus and get rid of the virus. Now that's how essentially all the vaccines actually work. That's the basic principle. Now asking the question, how do the mutants affect the vaccination strategy? Is there an effective way of dealing with the mutants? Now, remember,
efficacy, before that, the efficacy, Dr. Mande, I mean, the efficacy of each, we hear so many things. So before we go to the mutant, what is the efficacy of, say, the mRNA versus viral vector or whole virus? We have, right from Pfizer, which is mRNA, we have Oxford, which is more the adenovirus, and then we have the Sputnik, and we have the Chinese. So what is their efficacy? And of course, we have our own indigenously developed vaccines.
I will give you an example of Moderna. Let us take numbers. Now, when we do clinical trials, what we do is we take a vaccine candidate. We tell the regulators that this vaccine candidate has been proven to be safe. So we have to prove that it is safe for injection. And then we have to show that it elicits good immune response in the body. That is called as a phase 1 and phase 2, some sort of a thing, phase 2A. Once we have done that, the regulator gives approval for conducting phase 3. Now, in a phase 3 trials, you have large number of healthy volunteers, healthy people, right? And they don't have any comorbidities and things like that. Now, in the case of Moderna, they took something like about 20,000-30,000 volunteers, and they injected the candidate into these volunteers. And then they waited for the next few months before some number of volunteers actually developed real COVID-19, symptoms of COVID-19. So they waited till about 196 people developed COVID-19 symptoms, all right, despite vaccination. Now, when we actually vaccinate healthy individuals, this is typically a blinded study. Some people are given actual vaccine and some people are given placebo. Right? The placebo is not a vaccine, but just a thing which will does no harm to the body. So 196 people developed COVID. Out of this, about 20,000 people who have been vaccinated. At that time, Moderna approached a regulator and said that all the data about who has been given the vaccine and who has been given the placebo is sealed in an envelope. Allow us to open the envelope and assess our results. So when the results were assessed, when the envelopes were opened, it turned out that out of 196, 185 were those which had received a placebo, 185. Only 11 of those were the ones who have been given vaccine. So this number translates to about 94% efficacy. You can imagine 185 people developed this thing because of placebo. Only 11 developed because of the actual vaccine. So that turns out to be about 94% efficacy of the virus. And therefore, it's very exciting. Similarly, for AstraZeneca, if 100 people, about 170 people developed COVID-19, about 100 out of them had been, about 130 people developed COVID-19, 100 of them had placebo and 30 of them had the vaccine. And therefore, efficacy is about 70%. Now, this is efficacy. Efficacy is developed, calculated based on healthy individuals. When we come into actual field, there are many people who are elderly, who have comorbidities and so on and so forth. And therefore, there the protection would be different than the efficacy. And that is what is called as effectiveness. So the effectiveness number in actual field might be different than the efficacy numbers. So that's the thing that is different. There's efficacy and effectiveness is different. And that's how the efficacy of a virus is calculated, of a vaccine is calculated, that large number of people who have been given the vaccine during trials are seen to be protected when they actually don't develop the actual disease. That's how it is actually calculated.
Thank you. Then the mutant, now we'll come to the mutant and vaccine.
That's right. So in a mutation, what happens is that the mutations typically happen in the regions which are selected. As I told you, mutations are random, but those mutants that proliferate, which are selected for survival in human host. And therefore, it is natural to believe that a lot of mutations will arise on the spike protein, right? Now, virus has a coat and many spike proteins on the surface. Spike protein has a few mutations here and there. But the body's immune system actually looks at the whole virus as it is. The immune system of the body has generated antibodies against the whole viral particle. It's not only on the small region of the spike protein or something. So the antibodies exist against the entire virus from all different aspects. Antibodies see the entire virus in its entity. But the mutations in spike proteins are in localized regions here and there. And therefore, what the scientific community would like to believe is that despite the virus being mutated, antibodies would still recognize the virus, and therefore the vaccines would still be effective, as long as there are not a large number of mutations that are accumulated in the virus. What happens in influenza and all like that every year, when the influenza every year comes seasonal flu, that influenza virus has already accumulated a very large number of mutations. And what it actually leads to what we call as antigenic drift. And the body's immune system don't actually recognize the last year's influenza virus that came and this year's influenza virus that is there. And therefore, we have to actually take a seasonal shot of influenza vaccine. In SARS-CoV-2, as of now, we don't have any evidence to believe that such a big antigenic drift is taking place. And therefore, we consider ourselves lucky that although there are mutations, the vaccines are still effective against the mutants.